Hey everyone! Today I'm going to show you a pretty old tutorial. I filmed it 2.5 years ago when I was sent this sheet from Millie Marotta's coloring book Island Escape as a promo copy. Since it's a pretty old video, I just wanted to quickly show you the process and talk a little bit about combining colors. I got a couple of samples of paper and although I'm always careful, I started pretty boldly. I wanted vibrant underwater colors, so I applied white matte acrylic paint as a base here to cover the lines from the line art. I also wanted some kind of vibrant background for the pencils, so I started with a felt tip pen and saw that it wouldn't work. Somehow the combination of these mediums caused the pencils to not glide nicely and I have trouble with quite messy blending. Then I tried a combination of watercolor pencils and colored pencils and that was somehow easier but still quite messy. It was only after a few messy leaves that I managed to somehow figure out the best way to paint. Sometimes it just happens that the combination of acrylic and pencils and the paper I'm working on isn't perfect, so I always try to combine things somehow. Today, I would only use acrylic as a base if I were painting in a coloring book with paints, and I often just use gesso as a base for the pencils. I started coloring from what might seem like an unusual spot, the bottom right, simply because I saw that area as a combination of green-blue leaves and perhaps the darkest part of the page. It caught my eye and I thought it would be easy to combine colors on the leaves. What I want to mention here is that I try to use blues and greens in a way that balanced warmer and lighter tones with cooler and darker ones. We naturally perceive warm colors as being closer to us, while cooler ones seem to recede, and I apply this idea to the leaves. You'll notice I place the warm greens above the cooler blues, as green is considered warmer than blue due to the yellow in it. Even though I put the blue on top, it's lighter and more vibrant. So the darker blues and cooler greens were placed below, which helped create a sense of depth. I even added a bit of yellow and brown to some of the limbs for warmth, which definitely helped refresh the cool tones and made the leaves feel more interesting. It was the same with a touch of purples. A small pop of a different color can really make the page more lively. I colored the stones in natural tones, keeping in mind that since it's an underwater scene, it would be good to add a bit of bluish green. The color should blend slightly with the stone's natural tones, so I played around with greenish blue shades here and there to create a subtle shimmering effect. As for the water, my first thought was that it would be great to use watercolors because of their transparency, but I was a bit worried about how it would turn out since the paper isn't the best at absorbing water. I also wanted to hide the black lines to make the water look more believable, so I tested a small area by applying a white acrylic base first to see how the watercolors would behave. If you don't mind the black lines, using acrylic or gesso isn't necessary. I actually prefer when watercolors go directly onto the paper, but having a base can help the paper handle the watercolors better. Since this isn't a book page, I drew a pencil frame and I'll extend the image a little toward the edge by adding some darker and slightly blurred leaves as if they were in the background. This way there won't be any sharp edges, and I'll also add a lot of dark color for depth to make it look like the leaves disappear into the shadows. In the foreground, a few simple stones will help fill out the page, along with the warm green color of the ground. After the matte acrylic paint dried, I started experimenting with watercolors to see what shapes I could create. Because of the acrylic base, the watercolor tended to dance around a bit uncontrollably, and I wanted to create nice-looking waves following Millie's lines. So, as I worked, I realized that the colored pencils would have to define the shapes. Instead of focusing too much on the details, I just made a loose watercolor base to help me see where to place the colors and which parts I would need to work on more. I let the watercolor base dry again, and in the meantime, I moved on to the fish. When we have beautiful colors like turquoise blues and greens making up most of the page, it's best to highlight smaller details like the fish with complementary colors, in this case orange and red. I'll also add a bit of warmth with yellow so they stand out perfectly against the blue-green background. Some people would simply color these small details with pencils, but I usually reach for a clean brush first because I find it more pleasant to work that way. The colors appear much faster, even though I have to dry them and layer more to bring out the details. I enjoy this process, and it also serves as good practice. Of course, you can do all of this with just vibrant color pencils if you prefer. Everyone has their own style. On some of the fish, I first added a watercolor pencil layer, and on others I used watercolor paint. I started with yellow to create lighter areas, so I wouldn't overdo it with dark reds, which I gradually added to shape the fish better. Once the color is well set, it's much easier to see which parts need retouching with pencils, and blending also becomes smoother when the fish already has a base. When coloring a page using complementary colors, it's important to keep a good balance so that the colors highlight important details without clashing. This page is a great example. Most of it is filled with water and leaves, which naturally go in turquoise tones, while the fish are warmer colors. In general, when working with complementary colors, you want to avoid using them in equal amounts. For example, if you colored a page full of flowers using 50% orange and 50% blue, it would look crowded and chaotic. It's much better to choose one dominant color and then use the complementary color just for small details to make them stand out in the best way. When these colors are placed next to each other, they look more intense and vibrant. This is great for small details that you want to make pop out of the image, like this fish. So complementary colors can make a page look really vibrant and beautiful, but they need to be used carefully to keep everything in harmony. I also added a little purple or pink to the fish, but with warmer tones than on the leaves, just to help them blend in nicely. These small touches of a different shade don't change the overall effect of the complementary colors, but they do make the page feel a little richer. If you add small touches like that to one part, try to gently spread them out in other areas too, but be careful not to overdo it. I also try to make the fish a bit pinker or even lighter as I move toward the upper left corner to create the impression of moving toward the lighter part of the scene. For the top left corner with leaves and rocks, I used lighter colors for the lighter leaves. Since I continued with the same acrylic base, I had a bit of trouble blending those leaves smoothly, but I just ignored it and focused on creating interesting colors. I also used the watercolor as a base color to see how the lighter shades would look, and later it was much easier to go over with colored pencils to add depth and lighten certain parts. Again, I used darker blues below the warmer green and turquoise blues, and lighter shades above the darker ones. I also mixed in some warm tones into the green leaves, just like I did at the beginning of this coloring. I'll also add a bit of turquoise watercolor to the rocks. It's a little trick I do often just to try to get some depth. Namely, the rocks are already colored with pencils, and of course the watercolor won't take well. but what it does is it kind of smudges those pencils barely noticeable, and I often think it gives an interesting effect, so I especially like to use it on objects in the background. All that's left now is just highlighting, final blending, and finishing the page. The water was actually the hardest part for me to figure out because I wanted to create some special waves, but in the end I decided to simply follow Millie's lines. They have a really beautiful flow, so I just added darker colors in the corners and under the lighter parts of the waves to make sure those shapes didn't get lost. I finished the background with watercolor pencils by gradually using lighter colors as I moved toward the top left corner, while keeping the background shades just a little darker. You always want to make sure that the things in the foreground and in focus don't get lost, so the background shouldn't be distracting. That's why I only added a few leaves here and there with soft, undefined edges to give the impression that they're fading into the background. At the very end, I added a little mix of acrylic paint and the watercolor pencils I used, just to fix some of the leaves that didn't blend perfectly and to make it easier to add highlights where needed. I also used darker watercolors to create enough contrast. You can see that this final part takes me quite a long time. Maybe I'm a bit of a perfectionist, something I'm trying to work on so I don't get stuck on unnecessary details. But I do spend a lot of time looking at the picture in the end, always wanting to fix something. It's important to know when to stop though, and sometimes I just ask myself, if I add this, will it really make the picture better? Overall, I really enjoyed working on this page, even with some technical difficulties while mixing techniques. Since this is a forgotten tutorial from 2.5 years ago, it's actually fun to look back and see how I used to work. I might simplify some things now and use a few different techniques, but the point is I still really like how the page turned out, especially because of the color combinations. I've always loved underwater scenes where you can play with watercolors and mix different shades. I'm sorry this was a bit more simplified tutorial and I couldn't show the exact step-by-step process because it would have taken too many parts due to how long and complex it was. That's why I focused more on showing you the techniques I used and explaining a bit about colors. I hope the video was helpful anyway, and if it did, a like or a comment would mean a lot and help me continue making more videos. Thank you so much for your support and for watching, and see you soon.